Hello everyone, and welcome to another video on low-budget gaming PC builds. For this build, I went with the Intel Core i7-4790K, a quad-core 8-thread chip that's often seen as one of the most well-balanced options in terms of performance, price, and overall stability. This CPU uses the LGA 1150 socket and comes with a base clock of 4.0 GHz and can boost up to 4.4 GHz out of the box. That's already incredibly strong performance at stock settings, and it doesn't require any tweaking. Because of that, the CPU can run reliably over the long term without putting too much stress on the motherboard. I picked up this 74790K on the used market for around $40. Next up is the motherboard choice. For this build, I went with a budget motherboard because real-world gaming performance doesn't actually come from the motherboard itself. My choice here is the Asus B85. It uses the LGA 1150 socket, perfectly matching our i7-4790K. Compared to Z97 series boards, the B85 is much more basic. It doesn't support overclocking on the multiplier side, but in return, you get a lower price. And for a budget gaming setup, it still delivers a very solid gaming experience. Paired with the Core i7-4790K, the B85 makes a lot of sense, since the CPU is already strong enough at stock clocks and doesn't require overclocking. I picked up this motherboard for around $15 on the used market. The board came complete with the I/O shield, which was a nice bonus at this price point. The CPU I bought on the used market didn't come with a cooler, so I went with a solid air cooling solution. In this case, I'm using the Johnsbo CR1200, a single tower cooler that cost me around $5. Since the i7-4790K can run a bit warm, especially under sustained loads, having a decent cooler is important to keep temperatures stable while gaming. The CR1200 features a nice design with good heat dissipation, and this setup keeps the CPU cool and quiet during typical gaming sessions. As for RAM, the LGA 1150 platform uses DDR3 memory. Here I'm running dual-channel 16 GB of Kingston DDR3 at 1600 MHz. I bought this kit on the used market for around $22. Dual-channel configuration is really important for getting the best performance out of this system, and 16 GB gives us plenty of headroom for gaming and multitasking without any bottlenecks. Next up we have the case. I choose a MIK office case, also bought used. This is a pretty standard micro ATX case that gets the job done. It's simple and functional for a budget build. For the power supply, I went with a Corsair 450 watt unit. This build doesn't actually need massive amounts of power, so 450 watts provides plenty of headroom. Since this is a quality unit from Corsair, even though it's used, I feel confident it will keep the system stable over long-term use. The power supply I'm using here cost me around $18 on the used market. For storage, I went with a 240 GB drive, which is enough for Windows and a few of my go-to games. In this build, I chose a 2.5-inch SATA SSD from ADATA for faster load times and a smoother day-to-day experience. The drive I'm using here is priced at around $18 on the used market. And finally, to pair with the CPU, I chose a graphics card from NVIDIA, the Palit GeForce GTX 1060 Storm X with 6 GB of VRAM. I picked this card up on the used market for around $85. The biggest advantage of the GTX 1066GB VRAM is its excellent 1080p gaming performance and its 6GB of VRAM, which gives it a clear edge over 3GB variants and competing cards in the same price range. First up, we have VALORANT on medium settings at 1080p resolution. This setup is delivering some seriously impressive numbers here. We're pushing over 200 FPS in deathmatch mode. When you're actually playing, it's extremely smooth. Absolutely zero stuttering or lag, with 1% lows sitting at a solid 100 frames per second. What's really nice about this is that both the CPU and GPU are only running at around 50% utilization, which means temps are super cool. We're talking just 60 degrees Celsius on both components. Zero complaints here. This is exactly the kind of performance you want when you're trying to rank up.
Healer down. Yikes.
Moving on to Counter-Strike 2, I've got this running at 960p with tryhard settings enabled. Now we're seeing around 100 FPS average with 1% lows at 80. The CPU temperature remains at 56 degrees Celsius, but you'll notice the clock speed isn't quite as stable as in VALORANT. It's fluctuating between 4.0 and 4.2 GHz pretty much constantly. Interestingly, the GPU is only being utilized at about 50%, but it's already consuming 4.2 GB of VRAM. Temperature on the GPU has climbed to 73 degrees Celsius, still very playable, especially for competitive play, but the CPU is showing a bit of inconsistency here. Next up, GTA 5 on very high settings is performing really well here. We're averaging 90 FPS with 1% lows at 68, which is super solid for cruising around Los Santos. CPU usage is at 60%, temp sitting at 62 degrees Celsius, maintaining that stable 4.2 GHz clock. The GPU is maxed out at 100% utilization, consuming 3.6 GB VRAM. Classic GPU bottleneck, but honestly, this is great performance for very high settings. Next up, PUBG on low settings. We're averaging 95 frames per second with 1% lows dropping down to 30, which is quite a significant dip. The reason for this becomes clear when you look at the CPU utilization, which has jumped up to 85%. Because of this increased workload, the CPU temperature has climbed to 70 degrees Celsius, though it's still maintaining that 4.2 GHz clock speed. Now the GPU is really being pushed here at 90% utilization, and because we're dealing with a single fan card with not the greatest cooling solution, we're seeing temperatures hit 82 degrees Celsius. Next up, for Forza Horizon 5 on medium settings, we're looking at an average of 70 frames per second with 1% lows at 65. The CPU is only being used at about 50%, sitting at 56 degrees Celsius and holding steady at 4.2 GHz. The GPU, however, is maxed out at 100% utilization and running at 82 degrees Celsius. This tells us that in this title, We're definitely GPU bound rather than CPU limited, which is actually what you want to see in a well-balanced system for racing games. Moving on, Ghost of Tsushima on medium settings is giving us around 50 frames per second average, but those 1% lows drop to just 20, which you'll definitely notice during intense combat sequences. CPU usage is at 50%, temperature at 58 degrees Celsius, maintaining 4.2 GHz. The GPU is maxed out at 100% and consuming 4.1 GB of VRAM. This is one of those titles that really demands a bit more from the graphics card. CYBERPUNK 2077 on medium settings is averaging 45 frames per second with 1% lows at 24. The CPU is sitting at 71% utilization, 62 degrees Celsius, stable at 4.2 GHz. GPU is completely maxed out at 100% and using 3.1 gigs of RAM. Now in my opinion, you might want to consider implementing a 40 FPS cap here, much like you would on something like a Steam Deck, just to ensure a more consistent experience as you're exploring Night City.
Get lost!
Moving on, Elden Ring on high settings is performing quite well actually, averaging 55 frames per second with 1% lows at 37. CPU usage is relatively light at 45%, temperature at 60 degrees Celsius, holding 4.2 GHz. GPU is maxed out at 100% with 3.1 GB of VRAM in use. This is pretty respectable for a game that can be quite demanding in certain areas. Next up, God of War on original settings is giving us 55 frames per second average with 1% lows at 45. The CPU is working harder here at 90% utilization. Temperature has climbed to 70 degrees Celsius, but it's still stable at 4.2 GHz with a TDP of 62 watts. The GPU is maxed out at 100%, using 3.1 GB of VRAM and pulling 90 watts. The higher CPU usage suggests this title really benefits from having those extra threads available.
You're turning! Come back down! That's it!
Next up, The Last of Us Part 1 on medium settings is averaging 40 frames per second with 1% lows at 30. CPU utilization is up at 90%, temperature at 65 degrees Celsius, maintaining 4.2 GHz. The GPU is completely maxed out and consuming 5 GB of VRAM with a TDP of 85 watts. This is one of the more demanding titles in today's test, and you can really see the system being pushed to its limits.
Keep looking at me, baby. We're gonna get out of this. I promise. Go!
Moving on, Red Dead Redemption 2 on Ultra settings is averaging just 30 frames per second, with 1% lows at 29, which is incredibly consistent actually. CPU usage is surprisingly low at just 36%, temperature at 53 degrees Celsius, stable at 4.2 GHz. The GPU is doing all the heavy lifting here at 100% utilization with 4.2 GB VRAM in use. This is definitely a GPU-bound scenario, and you might want to dial back some settings for a smoother experience. Finally, we have Dying Light 2 on medium settings, averaging 40 frames per second with 1% lows at 28. CPU usage is light at 37%, temperature at 55 degrees Celsius, stable at 4.2 GHz. GPU is maxed out at 100% using 2.9 GB of VRAM with a TDP of 85 watts.